paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Welcome to the Nick Bryan Podcast. Today, my guest is a true warrior for truth, Doug Valentine. The noted historian and author Roger Morris said this about Doug. As no other writer, Doug Valentine has been to the heart of darkness in American foreign policy and come back with stories of historic moment. His brilliant, courageous work is revelation, prophecy, wisdom. It will stand as a singular mark of our saving capacity to learn. It's good to see you again, Doug.
Yes, I'm glad to be back. Glad to be able to be back. Yeah.
We're both the walking wounded, but at least we're walking. I mean, that's
yes. And you got to keep your brain active and keep trying to stay engaged. You know, it's true as you get older, use it or lose it.
Yeah. Well, I think I lost it many years ago, but I keep trying. So Doug has a tremendous amount of work that he's completed over the years, and I'm going to ask him about different books that he's written. He was really the first author to really dive into the Phoenix program. And he wrote a book called The Phoenix Program, America's Use of Terror in Vietnam. And it was published in 1990. And it opened a lot of eyes about what was actually going on in Vietnam. Could you give us a little background on that, Doug?
Sure. I had written my first book about my father, who had been a prisoner of war in World War II. And he had never told anybody in the family what had happened to him. And he had had a couple of heart attacks. And after his second open heart surgery, they told him if he wanted to survive, he had to get this secret off his chest about what happened to him in World War II. And so he told me. And he'd been in a prison camp in the Philippines. And the prisoners had mutinied against their officers. And actually, the officer in charge of the prison camp, that book was called the Hotel Tacloban, had arranged for the capture of a couple of prisoners who tried to escape. And so a bunch of the prisoners got together and killed this guy. So the war was still going on when the camp was liberated. So the military covered it up, and they told all the survivors, if you ever tell anybody what happened, we'll court-martial you and send you to prison for the rest of your life. So my father lived with this secret, and he'd been involved in a military cover-up. And after I finished that book, which was pretty well received, and I thought, well, this writing stuff is easy, I decided I would write a book about Vietnam and see if there was a part of Vietnam which had been covered up and which had affected Vietnam veterans the same way that the cover-up had affected my father, because I was 17 in 1967. I was eligible for the draft. My generation grew up with the Vietnam War. When the veterans came home, there's a lot of things they couldn't talk about. They couldn't talk about a lot of things because a lot of the war had been waged against civilians, and it was not usual for the American military to be fighting against civilians. I mean, they're usually fighting against Panzer divisions or Japanese divisions out on the islands of the Pacific. And so a lot of Vietnam veterans were traumatized by that experience. But I wanted to know if there was a part of it that had actually been covered up. And I went to a VA center near where I lived at the time. And the VA director just said to me, the Phoenix program. And I said, what's that? Well, I had no idea. It was 1983, 1984. And he said, well, there's a guy here at the VA hospital, and he was involved in it. And I'll arrange for you to talk to him. And the guy said he wouldn't talk to me. And I thought, well, if this secret is so serious that people don't even want to talk to me, I'm going to write a book about it. And being kind of a person from nowhere, I wrote a letter to William. I read a little bit about the Phoenix program, and I found out that a former director of Central Intelligence, William Colby, was the person who was most closely associated with the program. He had testified, he had actually been the CIA station chief in Vietnam for a number of years. He'd run the CIA's Far East Asia division, which included Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And he had run an organization in South Vietnam called CORDS, which was the parent the organization that oversaw Phoenix. Phoenix was an office in CORDS, so Colby had actually overseen the Phoenix program. And he testified to Congress on a couple of occasions about the Phoenix program, and he gave the for public, definition and explanation of Phoenix. Anyway, I thought, well, this is a good place to start, and I wrote him a letter, asked him if he would help me write the book, and I sent him a copy of this first book, Hotel Tacloban, about my father. And he called up, and he said, come down to Washington and I'll talk to you. And it was like a shock, because I was not a name like Seymour Hersh. I was not a Vietnam War correspondent. And to this day, I have no idea why he decided to help me. But I went down to Washington, and I met him at his law office, and he started introducing me to the CIA the senior CIA officers that who actually run the Phoenix program, and that were the heads of the various facets of the CIA and the military that Phoenix coordinated. Phoenix was an organization itself that coordinated existing operations and organizations and focused them on the attack against what was called the Viet Cong infrastructure, the spy network that was behind the insurgency in South Vietnam. And these were 90% civilians. Somebody who was a farmer somewhere, could have been the liaison between the North Vietnamese units and political cadres in the area. There was a whole vast network, and Phoenix went about identifying everybody in this network, which was a nationwide network, identifying them, mounting operations against them, and detaining them in really brutal interrogation centers. And if they weren't going to resist, then if they were resisting, then just sending out assassination squads to kill them. And all of this was illegal and violated the Geneva Conventions. But 20 years had passed, 15, 20 years had passed since the time that Phoenix was in operation. And Colby felt it was time for somebody to tell the inside story, and he didn't want it to be one of the old Vietnam War correspondents. And there was something he liked about me, and pretty soon I was just, CIA officers were asking me about parts of the Phoenix program, because within a year or two, I knew more about it than anybody, even most people in the CIA. And eventually, I put all that information together into the book, and William Morrow decided to publish it in 1989. And, the book explains itself.